The queue had been moving for 3 hours before Marcus Hale realized he was standing in the wrong one. He had noticed a few things in the preceding hour and a half that he should have paid more attention to. The forms, for instance, they were a pale violet color rather than the standard issue gray he'd been handed at the transit hub. The stamp at the top of the page used a glyph he didn't recognize, which he'd attributed to regional administrative variation. The woman who processed the form 2 stations ahead of him had glanced at him twice, with an expression that landed somewhere between professional neutrality and something he couldn't name. He'd assumed she was tired. The gray queue, the civilian supplemental labor queue, the one he'd actually been directed to, was 30 meters to his left, currently boarding its 4th group of the morning. He established this fact at 9:47 when he reached the front of the violet queue, placed his form on the counter, and looked up at the intake officer. The intake officer looked at him for 4 full seconds. Then she looked at the form, then at him again. She had pale silver skin, dark amber eyes behind a thin, transparent visor, and the rigid posture of someone who had processed approximately 12,000 intakes in her career and had never once processed one like this. "Human," she said, "not a question." "Yes," Marcus said. "Marcus Hale, supplemental contract applicant." "I was." "This is the intake station for the Kelsara Veth," she said. He didn't know what that meant. He said so. She seemed to find this both accurate and catastrophic. She looked at his form again. He had filled it out completely and correctly, in block letters, with his full documentation attached in the order specified by the subform instruction sheet. He had also, he now noticed, filled out a form that was entirely the wrong color. "The Kelsara Veth," she said again, more carefully, as if volume and precision together might transfer the information in a way that simple speech had failed. "The Royal Corps of the Velhari Concurrent, the Sovereign's own. The all-female ceremonial and combat unit that has been operational for 412 years, and has had, in that time, no male members of any species." Marcus absorbed this. "The gray queue," he said, "is the civilian supplemental." 30 meters left, she confirmed. "Yes." They looked at each other. He had been in the building for 3 hours and 40 minutes. He had eaten half a nutrition bar at 7:30 and nothing since. He had a contract deadline in 4 days for a water reclamation component installation in the 3rd district, which was why he had come to the labor supplemental office in the first place, to register his certification so he could pick up secondary work while he was between primary contracts. He had not planned to do anything interesting today. He started. "You have," she said, cutting him off with the deliberate patience of someone reading from a procedure she had never expected to invoke, "submitted a complete and correctly filled application to the Kelsara Veth intake queue. Under Article 14 of the Concurrent Supplemental Enrollment Agreement, the agreement that governs joint human Velhari administrative facilities such as this one, an intake submitted in full and in good faith cannot be unilaterally voided by intake staff. It must be reviewed by a commanding officer." She paused. "This has not happened before. So I haven't accidentally joined." "You have submitted an application. Whether you have joined anything is not within my authority to determine." She stamped the form. The stamp was a dark violet, and it landed with a sound of considerable finality. "Report to Corridor 7, Level 3, at 1100. Bring your documentation." Corridor 7, Level 3, was not a gray administrative corridor. It was a high-ceilinged hall with inlaid floor panels in the deep blue-black of Velhari formal space, and the light came from strips along the upper wall rather than overhead fixtures, which gave everything a quality Marcus associated with ceremonial architecture rather than labor processing offices. There were weapons racks on the walls. The weapons were not decorative. They were long-bladed and precisely mounted and maintained, with the care that distinguished a tool in active use from a tool on display. He stood at the far end of the corridor for the 3 minutes before 1100 and looked at the weapons racks and the inlaid floor and the quality of the light, and thought about the intake officer's face when she'd stamped the form. The stamp had been dark violet, and it had landed with a sound that was harder and more final than the sound administrative stamps usually made. He had learned in the subsequent 12 hours that this was because Kel-Saraveth administrative stamps were different from standard-issue concurrent stamps. They were heavier, made from a different alloy, and the stamp itself was a stylized rendering of the fourth seal rather than a simple authorization mark. This he'd learned from the Provisional Housing Orientation document, which had been given to him at 1330 by Yanara Vel, and which he'd read completely that evening, because his father had also had opinions about not reading orientation documents. The orientation document had contained, among other things, a one-paragraph description of the Kel-Saraveth's founding history. It had been established in the year equivalent to 1614 in the human calendar, during a succession crisis, when the sovereign of the period had determined that an independent ceremonial and protective unit, one whose loyalty was to the office, and the concurrence continuity rather than to any individual political actor, was a structural necessity rather than a luxury. The all-female composition had been a deliberate choice at founding. The sovereign of the period had argued that a unit whose membership was categorically excluded from succession itself was a unit whose institutional incentives aligned with protection rather than ambition. 412 years later, the argument was still considered sound. Marcus had read this paragraph twice and thought about the intake officer's face, and the stamp, and the fact that the argument was genuinely sound. And then he'd gone to sleep, because the provisional schedule started at 600. At 1100 exactly, a door at the far end of the corridor opened. The officer who came through it was tall. Most Velhari were taller than Marcus, who was solidly average by human standards, which put him firmly in the lower range of Velhari heights. She had deep blue-violet skin, white hair pulled back with military precision, and the kind of bearing that made the corridor feel like it was bracing. She was flanked by 2 other officers, one of whom was carrying his violet form. She stopped 3 meters from him. She looked at him with the same unreadable precision as the intake officer downstairs, except that there was considerably more of it, and it lasted longer, and she was clearly running a more thorough assessment. "Hail," she said. "Yes, Commander," he said, on the logic that she was clearly the person in charge and that correct address would not hurt him here. Her expression shifted slightly, not warm, more like the recalibration of someone who had expected something and received something different. "I am Second Voice Kel-Sarova Ven," she said. "Commanding Officer, 3rd Formation Kel-Saraveth. You have submitted an application to my unit." She paused. "Explain your intent." Marcus explained his intent. He explained it completely and without omission. The transit hub, the labor supplemental office, the form that was a different color than he expected, the hour and a half of not noticing, the stamp at 9:47. He explained that he had a water reclamation certification and a contract in the 3rd District, and that he was attempting to register for secondary work between primary contracts. He explained that he understood he was in the wrong queue, and that he would be happy to proceed to the gray one immediately. Kel-Sarova Ven listened to all of this without interrupting. When he finished, there was a silence of approximately 4 seconds. "You filled the form correctly," said the officer holding his application. Her tone conveyed that this was both accurate and, under the circumstances, deeply inconvenient. "The Article 14 provision," Kel-Sarova Ven said, "requires me to review a complete good-faith intake application." She looked at his form again. "It does not specify that the applicant must be female. The specification is Velhari in origin and predates the Joint Administrative Framework by 300 years. The Joint Framework did not update it." Another pause. "This has not been an issue before." It was an honest mistake, Marcus said. Yes, she said. I know. She held the form for a moment longer. Article 14 also states that a commanding officer may accept a reviewed application on provisional terms, pending formal confirmation by the Voice Council. This provision exists for unusual circumstances. She looked at him steadily. I am going to exercise it. Marcus opened his mouth. Not because I believe you belong here, she said, clearly and without heat. Because the alternative is a procedural exception that requires Voice Council review regardless, and a provisional acceptance takes 3 days to complete, during which time you will be present, which is faster and causes less institutional disruption than the exception process. You will be housed in the provisional attachment quarters. You will be assigned a unit liaison. You will not touch anything marked restricted. You will not be issued weapons. You will, at the end of 3 days, return to the Gray Q and register your certification there, and this will be concluded. She paused. Questions? I have a contract. In 4 days, 3 days is inside that window. She turned. Report to the 3rd floor provisional intake at 1300. Liaison will be assigned then. She walked back through the door. Her 2 officers followed her. The one with his form left it on the hall's single chair as she passed it, as if she was done with a piece of evidence she no longer needed. Marcus stood in the corridor alone for a moment, looking at the weapons racks. He picked up his form and went to find lunch. The provisional intake officer at 1300 was a young Velhari with pale gray-silver skin, and the expression of someone who had been handed an administrative problem she had not anticipated when she woke up that morning. Her name was Yanara Vel, and she processed Marcus's secondary intake with the focused efficiency of someone who was not going to allow her feelings about the situation to appear in the documentation. Liaison, she said, when the paperwork was processed. She has been briefed. She will meet you in the East Wing common room at 1400. What's her name? Marcus asked. Subcommander Arith Sovakel. Yanara Vel looked at him with what he was beginning to recognize as the standard Velhari expression of someone recalibrating expectations. She volunteered. He did not know what to make of that. He went to the East Wing common room at 1400. The common room was occupied by 11 members of the Kel Soraveth when Marcus walked through the door. He would think about this later and try to identify the exact sequence, whether the silence happened first or the heads turning, or whether it was simultaneous, the particular quality of a room full of people noticing the same impossible thing at the same moment. He was fairly certain it was simultaneous. 11 heads turned. 11 sets of amber and blue and deep violet eyes landed on him. The conversation that had been ongoing, he could tell by the acoustic signature of the room, the particular quality of a space that had been full of sound 2 seconds before, stopped completely. He had walked into silences before. This was a different category. He stood in the doorway and made the calculation that leaving would be worse than staying, and walked to the nearest unoccupied chair. 11 pairs of eyes tracked him the entire way. He sat down. He put his documentation on the table. He looked up. He was still being stared at by 11 members of a 400-year-old elite military unit. "Hello," he said. One of the 11, seated at the far side of the room, posture differentiated from the others by a quality Marcus couldn't name, but would later identify as the particular stillness of someone who had decided to find something interesting rather than alarming, said, "Hello, human." Her skin was a deep, warm blue-violet, darker than most of the others in the room. Her eyes were pale gold, which was unusual, and her white hair was loose around her shoulders in the way that Marcus would eventually learn was informal off-duty for Velhari rather than actually casual, the distinction mattering considerably in context. She had the hands of someone who spent a meaningful portion of her life in physical training, and the eyes of someone who was currently running an assessment. "Arith Sovakel," she said, "your liaison." "Marcus Hale," he said, I filled out the wrong form. I know, she said. I read the intake report. She was tall, predictably, but carried it differently than Kale Sarova-Ven did, less like a statement and more like a fact, and crossed the room to his table. She sat across from him. The 11 other pairs of eyes in the room were still tracking, but a few had returned to their previous occupations, which Marcus counted as progress. Water reclamation engineer. Certification and installation primarily. I've been independent for 2 years. And you stood in the wrong queue for an hour and a half. The forms were violet. I thought it was a regional color variation. She looked at him for a moment. The intake forms for the Kel Saravath are violet because violet is the color of the sovereign's 4th seal. It's been that color for 412 years. I didn't know that. No, she agreed. You wouldn't. And then she said, the gray forms are pale gray, the color of base administrative stone. The two are not particularly similar. He thought about the form for a moment. They're similar in low light. The transit hub uses standard corridor lighting. I was looking at my phone when I picked up the form. She was quiet for 3 seconds. It was a different kind of quiet than the 11-person silence that had preceded it, more contained, like something being held back. You picked up the wrong form because you were looking at your phone. Yes. And then filled it out completely and correctly. My father was an administrative clerk. He had opinions about incomplete forms. Something changed in Arith Sovakel's expression. He would spend 3 days learning her expressions, which were controlled but not absent. Velhari used a different palette of visible emotion than humans, more concentrated in the eyes and the stillness or movement around the mouth, less in the broad face-wide shifts he was used to reading, and he would categorize this one later as contained amusement, the kind that was being managed because the situation didn't fully merit it yet. Your father was an administrative clerk, she said, and he gave you a strong opinion about form completion. He said incomplete forms were a failure of respect for whoever had to process them. And so you filled out a Kel Saravath intake application with full documentation in the correct order. I was also, Marcus said, in the queue for an hour and a half with nothing else to do. This time the contained amusement reached her eyes before she brought it back. I see, she said. She looked at his documentation. I'll walk you through the provisional schedule, 3 days. You'll have access to the common areas, the mess hall, the East Wing corridor, not the training floors, not the restricted archive, not the armory. Commander Ven was clear about the armory. She is always clear about the armory. Arith Sovakel picked up one of his certifications, read it, set it down. Water reclamation. What's the 3rd district contract? He explained it. A secondary loop intake manifold for a mid-tier residential block, the coupling seals corroded by mineral buildup, a 2-day installation, and a half-day calibration. Standard work. She listened with an attention that was more focused than the subject seemed to warrant, and asked one question about the mineral buildup profile that suggested she knew something about reclamation systems that was not common knowledge. Do you have engineering background? He asked. Logistics, she said. Infrastructure dependencies. It's part of the Corps' secondary mandate, facility and system integrity for protected sites. She set his 2nd certification down. Your work would qualify as a protected site contractor under the Concurrence Infrastructure Code. Is that relevant to the next 3 days? Possibly. She stood again. Mess hall opens at 17:30. I'll show you the East Wing layout. She walked him through the East Wing with the efficiency of someone who moved through spaces by knowing them rather than by looking at them, which Marcus respected. She named the rooms as they passed them. Common space, supplemental study, medical auxiliary, the corridor that led to the training floors he wasn't cleared for, and answered his questions about the Corps with the same quality of attention she'd given his certification, precise and without condescension. By 1800, he had learned that the Kel Sarah had 340 active members across 4 formations, that its founding mandate was the protection of the sovereign's person and the concurrent ceremonial functions, and that its secondary mandate had expanded over 4 centuries to include protected site integrity, which was why there were engineering-adjacent people like Arith Sova Kel inside it. That the 4-day review process for an Article 14 provisional had never, in the core history, been invoked for a male applicant of any species, because males had never submitted applications to the Kel Sarah intake, because the idea had presumably not occurred to anyone. Until you looked at your phone, Arith Sova Kel said, at the end of the East Wing corridor at the door of his provisional quarters. Until I looked at my phone, Marcus confirmed. She looked at him for a moment. Get some sleep, Hale. Provisional schedule begins at 600. She walked back the way they'd come, and he watched her go, and thought about the way she'd asked about the mineral buildup profile. Day 2 began with the mess hall. Marcus arrived at 600 and was the first person there, which he hadn't expected. He'd assumed military, even a military unit with a ceremonial component, would have early risers. He made himself tea from the ration station, found a table near the window, and was halfway through it when the mess hall filled in approximately 4 minutes with what felt like every member of the 3rd formation simultaneously. The silence was different this time, more distributed pockets of it, as each new person came through the door and registered his presence and made some private determination about how to respond. Some of them went to tables on the far side of the hall. Some went to tables near him, which he appreciated. One sat at his table without being invited and said, "You're the human who filled out the form." And he said yes, and she said, "Yenny Vell says you filled it out in the correct order, all documentation attached." And he said his father had strong opinions about incomplete forms, and she said, "I know, she told us," and sat there and ate her meal and said nothing else, which he found comfortable. Arith Sova Kel arrived at 6:17 and sat across from him, without the performance of making a decision about it. "You slept," she said. "I did. Some of the provisional attachments don't." She looked at his documentation, which he'd brought to the mess hall out of habit because he had some calibration notes he wanted to review. "The mineral buildup on the 3rd district manifold, what's the source?" He explained the source. She listened with the same precise attention. He asked why she wanted to know. "The concurrent has 4 protected residential blocks in the 3rd district," she said. 2 of them are on the same pipe network as the block you're contracted for. If the mineral buildup is systemic, they may need the same intervention." "I can look at the pipe network spec," he said. "I have access to it as part of my contract documentation." She paused. "You have the 3rd district pipe network documentation?" "On my contract drive, yes. Do you want me to pull it?" She was quiet for 3 seconds, looking at him with an expression he was beginning to read as recalibration in progress. "Yes," she said. "After breakfast." They spent an hour and 40 minutes after breakfast going through the pipe network documentation. Arith Sova Kel worked through it the way she moved through the East Wing corridor, with the quality of someone using knowledge they already had rather than acquiring it for the first time, the documentation confirming rather than informing. She identified 2 secondary connections he'd assessed as low priority and explained why they were actually higher, citing infrastructure load patterns he didn't have access to. He updated his calibration notes. She marked 3 protected site addresses on the network map. "These should be assessed before your current contract concludes," she said. "I can add them to my contract scope, or flag them for a separate contract if they need a different authorization level. Protected sites need core authorization. I can file that." She looked at the network map. "Which means your work would fall under the core secondary mandate, which means..." She paused. "Which means you would technically qualify as a registered protected site contractor for the Kel Sarah infrastructure secondary." They looked at each other. "Is that a thing?" Marcus asked. "It would require authorization from the Voice Council," she said, "and it has never been done before for a human contractor." She paused again. "But it's within the framework. Everything I've done in the last day and a half has apparently been within the framework." "Yes," she said. "It has." She was quiet for a moment. "The network assessment will take 2 days. Your provisional ends in 2 days," he said. She looked at the map. "I'm going to talk to Commander Venn." He spent the afternoon in the common room working on his calibration notes. The first Corps member who spoke to him did so at 14:13, and it was not about infrastructure. She sat down across the table from him, not across from him the way Arith Sovakel sat across from him, which was a deliberate act with a purpose, but at the far end of the same table, angled slightly away in the manner of someone who had not quite committed to being there, and said, "You're the human from the gray Q." "The wrong Q," he said. "The gray Q would have been correct. I was in the violet one." She considered this. She was younger than most of the Corps members he'd seen, with pale silver-blue skin and the particular kind of stillness that came from training rather than nature. "Why did you stay in the wrong queue for an hour and a half?" He explained about the color and the low light in the phone. She listened with the same expression the intake officer had worn, somewhere between professional neutrality and something that hadn't quite resolved, and then said, "You didn't realize even when the forms were handed over." "The regional variation theory," he said. "It seemed plausible at the time. Violet is the Sovereign's fourth seal color." "I know that now." "Everyone knows that. Everyone Velhari knows that," he said. "I grew up in the Hartwell district of the colony on Sina Station. The Sovereign's fourth seal color wasn't in the curriculum." She was quiet for a moment, processing this with the same quality of recalibration he was becoming used to. "What did you study?" "Fluid dynamics primarily, and material science for the reclamation work, some standard history, some trade route economics. The fourth seal color taxonomy wasn't covered." "We have a taxonomy," she said, with a quality that might have been, in a different context, mild indignation. "It's not that complex." "How many seals are there?" 12. "And each one has a color." "Each one has a primary color, and 2 secondary colors for subclassification." He thought about this. "I'm going to run into more problems," he said. "With the colors." Something shifted in her expression, the neutrality cracking slightly, not into warmth exactly but into the territory adjacent to it, the territory where 2 people have identified the same absurdity from different angles. "The third seal is orange," she said. "General administrative, what you'd get at the transit hub, usually." "Mine was gray." "Gray is the 5th seal, standard labor supplemental." The intake officer at the transit hub said the gray and violet forms were not particularly similar. "They're not. In low light they are." She looked at him for 3 seconds. "You're going to be here for 3 days," she said. "The provisional runs until 1100 day 4. 3 days, she said again, in a different tone, the tone of someone who had done a private calculation and was now deciding what to do with the result. "My name is Vel Saren Kell. I work the 4th Formation's infrastructure secondary." She paused. "What's your pipe network documentation situation?" He showed her. They spent 40 minutes on the 3rd District layout, and she identified 2 connections he hadn't flagged. The 9th branch's secondary intake, which she said had a historical tendency towards sediment accumulation, and a T-junction in the south line that was on a protected site he didn't have flagged in his contract scope. She knew the connections because she'd done 3 separate assessments in the 3rd District over the past 2 years, which he hadn't known was part of the core remit. She explained the secondary mandate framework with the efficient precision of someone who'd repeated it enough times to have edited it down to what mattered. Protected sites, Infrastructure dependency, the authorization chain. Subcommander Kell filed the council inquiry today, Vel Saren Kell said at the end of the documentation review. Provisionally registered as infrastructure adjacent. I know, she told me. She told me she filed it. Something in Vel Saren Kell's tone conveyed a precise quantity of information without specifying what the information was. She doesn't usually volunteer the process detail to people outside the formation. He thought about that. She volunteers what's useful, he said. Yes, said Vel Saren Kell, in the tone of someone confirming an observation they'd been making for considerably longer than he had. She does. She stood, gathering her own documents. The 9th branch secondary intake added to your flagged list. It's not a crisis, but it should be in your assessment range. I will, thank you. She looked at him for a moment. The gray queue, she said, boards 4 groups and closes by noon. You would have been in the 2nd group. I know. You'd have your labor supplemental registration and be back in the 3rd district by now. Yes. She nodded, as if he'd confirmed something, and walked to the other side of the room to rejoin a conversation she'd apparently left midstream. By 3 in the afternoon, the dynamic of the room had shifted from the quality of a space, accommodating an anomaly, to the quality of a space where one person happened to be in the corner doing paperwork, while other people used the space for its usual purposes. 2 more core members had spoken to him after Vel Saren Kell brief exchanges, calibration-related, both of them precise and without ceremony, both of them leaving him with useful information he hadn't had before. The 11-person silence from the day before had not returned. What had replaced it was something more ordinary, the adjustment of a room to a presence that had initially registered as impossible and was increasingly registering as a person who is here, doing a thing. At 16:30, Arith Sovakel came back. She sat across from him with the particular quality of someone who had done something and was in the moment of presenting the results. Commander Venn, she said, has agreed to extend the provisional by 2 days to accommodate the network assessment. She has also filed a preliminary inquiry with the Voice Council regarding the protected site contractor framework. 2 more days. Yes, and a Voice Council inquiry has a minimum response time of 7 days. She paused. So pending the response, the provisional extends to cover the inquiry period. Marcus put his pen down. How long does a Voice Council inquiry usually take? For a novel question with no precedent, she considered, several weeks in most cases. He looked at her. She looked back at him. The expression on her face was the most legible it had been since he'd walked into the East Wing common room, not quite the contained amusement from the mess hall conversation, but in the same family. Deliberate. Present. You did this on purpose, he said. I filed an accurate report, she said, about a legitimate infrastructure question which required a legitimate inquiry which has a legitimate processing time. She paused. The network assessment is real. The protected site framework question is real. The filing is procedurally correct. You told me yesterday that the 2 secondary connections were higher priority than I assessed. They are. You could have sent that assessment to a different contractor. She was quiet for a moment. The documentation is on your contract drive, she said. You have the 3rd district network access. It would take 3 weeks to transfer that access to a new contractor and bring them up to the same level of familiarity you currently have. This was accurate. He knew it was accurate. He also knew that it was accurate in the specific way that accurate things sometimes were when someone had constructed the argument before presenting it. Arith Sovakel, he said. Hail. You volunteered to be my liaison. Yes. Yanara Vel said so yesterday. Yes. Why? The contained amusement was fully visible now, reaching her eyes the way it had in the mess hall and then not retreating. Because someone had to, she said, and I was curious. About the man who stood in the wrong queue for an hour and a half. About the man who stood in the wrong queue for an hour and a half, she confirmed, and then filled out the application completely and correctly because his father had opinions about incomplete forms. She paused. That combination of characteristics seemed worth investigating. He thought about that for a moment, and the investigation. She picked up the network map. Ongoing, she said, and unfolded it between them. Now. The fourth connection on the western secondary branch. What's your estimated load calculation for peak draw? Day 3 arrived with a thunderstorm over the city, which made the mess hall windows useful in the way windows during storms always were, and Marcus arrived at 5:58 and made his tea and watched the rain until Arith Sovakel sat across from him at 6:12, earlier than either of the previous days. You're early, he said. The Eastern Branch calculation was wrong, she said, and put a handwritten set of figures on the table. I ran the load numbers last night. Your peak draw estimate is off by 14% because the historical data for that branch doesn't include the Phase 3 residential expansion from 3 years ago. He looked at the figures. She had run the calculation completely, including the Phase 3 adjustment, which required access to the concurrence expansion records. You have access to the expansion archive. Corps' secondary mandate includes protected site infrastructure history, she said. The expansion records are part of it. This changes the assessment for the fourth connection significantly. Yes, and the sixth, which wasn't flagged at all. She pointed at the branch on the map she'd unfolded from the previous day, which was still on his side of the table. The sixth connection is on a protected site that went through a renovation 18 months ago. Nobody updated the load estimate. They worked through it. She brought the expansion records on a tablet, and he cross-referenced them against his contract documentation, and they recalculated the load assessment for 4 connections over the next 2 hours, while the storm moved overhead, and the mess hall filled and thinned around them. By 900, he had a significantly more accurate assessment, and a substantive problem. The sixth connection was running at 83% of rated capacity under peak draw conditions, which meant it was not in immediate failure but was in the range where intervention in the next 6 to 8 months was not optional. This needs to go in the council inquiry filing, he said. Yes, I'll update it today. She looked at the revised figures. This also means the timeline for the assessment changes. The sixth connection needs an on-site evaluation. I can do that before my current contract. The site is a protected residential block. It requires Corps authorization and escort. He looked at her. Corps escort. Standard protocol for protected sites, she said, with the particular quality of someone citing a genuine rule that is also, coincidentally, producing an outcome they find acceptable. Arith Sovakel. The rule predates me by 300 years, she said. I didn't write it. He thought about this for a moment. How long does a protected site evaluation usually take? For a 6th connection load assessment with a documented high utilization flag, she considered it with genuine seriousness. A full day on site. Possibly 2, depending on access to the maintenance records for the renovation 18 months ago. Those records are probably on my contract drive, he said. Are they? The 3rd District Network contract included historical maintenance access. What a coincidence, she said, and looked at the map, and the contained amusement was fully visible and making no attempt to retreat. He thought about the specific way she had looked at his certification on the first day, asking about mineral buildup, the way she'd moved through the pipe network documentation with the quality of someone confirming rather than learning, the 6-word question last night in the mess hall about peak draw, the expansion records she'd run at what was probably a late hour, producing figures in handwriting that was precise and unhurried. The investigation, he said. She looked up. You said it was ongoing. I did. What are the current findings? She was quiet for a moment, looking at him with the pale gold eyes that were unusual even by Velhari standards, which tended toward amber and dark and deep tones. The subject, she said carefully, is significantly more complicated than the original data suggested. The initial assessment, man stands in wrong queue through inattention, was accurate but incomplete. The longer assessment is, man stands in wrong queue through inattention, but then behaves in every subsequent moment with complete competence and good faith. The combination is, she paused, unusual. Unusual how? People who make large errors of inattention, she said, usually make small errors of the same kind. Cutting corners, missing details, the form filled in the correct order, all documentation attached. The network calculation that was off by 14% because of data you didn't have access to, not because you didn't do the work. The pipe connection two of my colleagues flagged yesterday afternoon. You'd already calculated it as low priority and you were wrong, but you updated your notes immediately when they pointed it out without arguing. She paused. You don't resist being wrong. You just correct and continue. He considered that. My father also had opinions about arguing with accurate information. Your father, she said, had a great many opinions. He was an administrative clerk for 31 years. He had time to develop them. She looked at the network map. The storm outside had moved east and the light through the mess hall windows had changed to the particular clear quality that came after rain, bright and without weight. The inquiry will take several weeks, she said. The on-site evaluation will take 1 to 2 days. The current contract will conclude in 4 days. After that, she was quiet for a moment. The infrastructure secondary mandate, the framework that would qualify a protected site contractor, has a provision for an ongoing working relationship rather than individual contract authorization. It's used for contractors whose work falls inside multiple protected sites in a sustained way. It has a review cycle of 6 months. A 6-month working relationship with a renewal provision. He looked at her. She was looking at the map with the attention she gave things she had already decided and was not quite ready to state directly, which he was beginning to recognize. You're telling me, he said, that there is a framework under which I could be, on an ongoing basis, a contractor whose work falls inside the core secondary mandate, requiring core authorization and escort for protected site evaluations, for a period of 6 months with a renewal provision. That is an accurate description of the framework, yes. And the inquiry currently filed with the Voice Council is asking whether this framework can apply to a human contractor. It is. And if the Council says yes, then you would need to formally apply for the working relationship, she said. There's a form, a pause, it's blue. He looked at her, she was still looking at the map. The pale gold eyes were not looking at him, but there was something in the quality of her stillness. The way she was not looking at him, that was as legible as looking. Arith Sovakel, he said. Hail. Are you asking me to fill out a form? She was quiet for 4 seconds. Then she turned to look at him with the contained amusement fully present and not retreating, and one thing more, something he'd been catching since the second day, and was now certain of: warmth, direct and steady, the kind that didn't announce itself but was there in the quality of attention, in the expansion records run the previous night, in the way she'd sat across from him in the mess hall on the first morning without making a performance of deciding to. I am, she said, suggesting that a form exists, and that you appear to be someone who fills out forms correctly, even when he picks up the wrong one. He looked at the blue sky morning through the cleared windows. He looked at the network map between them with its revised figures in her handwriting on the margins. He thought about 412 years of institutional history and a single afternoon at a transit hub when he'd been looking at his phone. What color is blue? He said, In the concurrence form classification system. Protected site working relationship applications, she said. It's been that color since the secondary mandate was formalized. It has, previously, only been filed by Velhari contractors. Until someone looks at their phone. Until someone looks at their phone, she agreed. He picked up his pen. Where do I get the form? He did not, in fact, fill out the form that morning. The form required voice counsel authorization first, and the inquiry was pending, and the correct sequence was the inquiry first, and then the application. His father would have agreed. You didn't fill out the downstream form before the upstream process completed. That was how you ended up with a violet application when you wanted a gray one. The on-site evaluation began on the 6th day of the provisional, 2 days after the original 3-day window had concluded. The extension filed and formalized before Marcus had time to think about the gray queue. The protected site was a residential block in the 3rd District's older quarter, built in the layered construction style Arith Sovakel had described in the Western Administrative District. 3 centuries of incremental addition without demolition, each era's approach to materials visible in cross-section if you knew what you were looking at. Marcus knew what he was looking at. He'd done 2 assessments in the older quarter before, and the maintenance records for buildings with that kind of layered history were always more complicated than standard build sites, because the documentation itself was layered, old records in old formats, translated through 3 archival systems, annotations that reference components that had been replaced and re-replaced without updating the original description. The maintenance records for the 6th Connections renovation, 18 months ago, were exactly that kind of document. He spent 4 hours on the first evaluation day sitting in the utility corridor with the records on his contract drive, and a tablet showing the current pipe layout, constructing the map of what had changed versus what the record said had changed versus what was actually present in the wall. Arith Sovakel sat across from him and read the records alongside him. This was not, he had gathered, standard protocol for a protected site escort. The escort was authorization and proximity, and in the event of a security situation, a qualified response. It was not participation in the documentation review. Arith Sovakel had not commented on this, and neither had he, and they had worked through the maintenance records with the same quality of parallel attention they'd brought to the network map in the mess hall and the expansion records on the 3rd day of the provisional. This coupling specification, she said at the 2nd hour, pointing to a line in the renovation records. The standard code for the 3rd District is J7. This says J9. He looked at it. He'd been about to flag it for a different reason. The installation depth was documented incorrectly, but she'd gotten there first from a different angle. J9 is a higher pressure rating, he said. Overkill for this network's output range. But the load draw measurement suggests it's running hotter than the network's standard output range. She looked at the current layout. Would a J9 coupling in a J7 application cause an asymmetric draw? He thought about it. If the tolerances are mismatched, the J9 is calibrated for a different flow velocity. In a lower velocity application, it would be running the primary intake valve against the wrong resistance curve, which would cause higher draw, yes, not catastrophic, but over 18 months it builds. He looked at the records again. The previous contractor may have specified J9 thinking the higher rating was safer. It's a common mistake. Higher rating is not always better, Arith Sovakel said, in the tone of someone for whom this was a principle that had applications beyond pipe couplings. No, he agreed. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the records. Can you correct it without replacing the whole intake? If the J9 coupling is accessible without demolishing the wall panel, yes. The coupling replacement itself takes 2 hours, calibration another 2. The hard part is getting to it. The renovation records should have the access panel location. She scrolled through the archive documentation. Here, south wall, panel 7. The renovation contractor noted it as a preferred access point. He found panel 7 in the current layout. It was behind a utility shelf that had been installed at some point in the past decade. The shelf was not in the renovation records, which meant it was post-renovation, which meant the access panel was behind a shelf that would need to be moved before anything else. 1 day for the assessment and access clearing, he said. 2nd day for the coupling replacement and calibration. That's what I estimated, she said. She put the tablet down. The shelf is a standard utility model. The installation screws will be accessible from the left side. He looked at her. Have you moved utility shelves before? The core secondary mandate includes facility maintenance for protected sites, she said. Yes, she paused. I also have the facility master access, which means I can authorize the shelf relocation without filing a secondary request. If you needed to do that through the standard contractor process, it would take 2 business days. Of course it would. The master access has been core infrastructure standard since the secondary mandate was formalized. 300 years ago. 280, she said, with precision. The secondary mandate came later than the founding. The core was originally purely ceremonial. He looked at the panel 7 location and the shelf that was currently in front of it, and thought about 280 years of infrastructure secondary mandate and the specific chain of practical decisions that produced a sub-commander who could cite renovation records and identify J9 coupling mismatches and move utility shelves without a filing delay. Your father, he said, didn't happen to be an administrative clerk. My father was a structural engineer, she said. 3rd District infrastructure before the 3rd District was under core secondary mandate. She paused. He had opinions about load calculations. He looked at her. She was looking at the pipe layout with the attention she gave things she was not quite ready to state directly. You grew up with the 3rd District network, he said. I know it fairly well, she said. Yes. He thought about the specific quality of the mess hall conversation on the first day, the expansion records run the previous night, the identification of the J9 coupling from the wrong angle. He thought about the investigation she'd said was ongoing. The 4th connection, he said. You knew about the Phase 3 expansion before you checked the expansion archive. She was quiet for a moment. I had a hypothesis, she said. The archive confirmed it. And the J9 coupling. The renovation records were accessible in the core infrastructure archive. I read them before we came. She looked at him steadily. I wanted to know what we were walking into. That's preparation, he said. Yes. Not investigation. They're not mutually exclusive, she said, and the pale gold eyes were doing the thing they did when the contained amusement and the warmth were both present at the same time, visible and not retreating. Get some sleep, Hale. Panel 7 takes 2 people to move the shelf. The on-site evaluation 2nd day was the coupling replacement. The shelf cleared by 800, the access panel opened by 900, the J9 coupling extracted and replaced with the correct J7 specification by 1300. Marcus recalibrated the system over the following 2 hours while Arith Sova-Kel stood in the utility corridor and watched the readout on the tablet with the same attention she gave network maps and expansion records and calibration figures. 61%, she said when the test completed. Under-rated capacity. Should hold for at least 5 years with standard maintenance, he said. Maybe 8, depending on the mineral content of the district water supply. The mineral content, she said, has been in the moderate range for 12 years. Then 7 years probably, possibly 8. She made a note. He cleaned the coupling tool and put it back in the case and looked at the restored utility corridor, which was no longer operating at 83% of rated capacity under peak draw, and thought about the specific way that a problem that had been building for 18 months could be resolved in 4 hours by someone who happened to have the maintenance records. "The inquiry," she said, not looking up from the note. "Yes." The voice counsel usually responds to infrastructure-related questions faster than the general average. 8 to 12 days. Faster than several weeks. In most cases, she looked up. I may have framed the inquiry as infrastructure adjacent rather than purely procedural. He looked at her. You may have. The 6 connection assessment strengthens that framing considerably. Arith Sovakel. Hale. You've been building a file. She put the tablet under her arm. I have been doing my job, she said, with precision and something underneath the precision that was warm and direct and certain of itself, which includes identifying infrastructure dependencies, filing accurate reports, and ensuring that the core secondary mandate is fulfilled by contractors who have demonstrated the capacity to do the work correctly. She paused. And who do not argue with accurate information. And who fill out forms. In the correct order, she said, all documentation attached. She turned toward the corridor exit. The mess hall closes at 2000. We have 40 minutes. He picked up his case and followed her out, and thought about blue forms and voice counsel timelines, and the quality of 7 or 8 years in the clear morning light. The voice counsel response arrived on the 11th day. Marcus was in the 3rd district by then, finalizing the primary contract, the secondary loop intake manifold, which he'd completed 3 days earlier, the calibration running clean on every test, when his comm notified him of a message from the Kel Sora Veth administrative office. He read it standing in the utility room of the residential block, with the newly calibrated manifold running quietly behind him, and the mineral-adjusted water supply flowing through the corrected system, and the early afternoon light coming through the narrow utility window. The voice counsel had approved the protected site contractor framework extension to human contractors operating under core secondary mandate authorization. The approval was specific rather than general. It was tied to the existing infrastructure inquiry and the documented assessment work, which meant it was tied to Marcus Hale, water reclamation engineer, 3rd district contractor, and the corrected load calculations for the 4th and 6th connections of the western secondary branch. There was a second message, from Arith Sovakel, sent 4 minutes after the administrative notice. It was short. It said, "The form is blue. I'll have it ready when you arrive. A." He looked at the message for a moment. He looked at the manifold. He put his comm in his pocket and finished packing his tools and locked the utility room and took the transit back to the Kel Sora Veth facility in the afternoon light. Kel Sorova then met him at the East Wing entrance. He had not expected this. He had expected Yanara Vel at the intake desk, or possibly no one official at all, and just the direction to the common room. The second voice was at the entrance with the particular bearing of someone who had made a decision and arrived early to convey it in person. "Hail," she said. "Commander." She looked at him for a moment with the same unreadable precision as the first day in Corridor 7, except that it was different now. Not the recalibration of an impossible situation, but the assessment of a known quantity. "The 6th connection," she said. 61% under rated capacity, should hold 7 to 8 years. The voice counsel received that figure in the inquiry update. "I heard. I'm glad it was useful." She was quiet for a moment. "You stood in the wrong queue," she said. "Yes." "For an hour and a half." "Yes." "And then," she said, "you fixed a problem that a standard protected site assessment had not flagged, because the historical data wasn't connected to the current load calculation." Subcommander Kell identified the gap, he said. "I had the contract data. Between the two, it was a straightforward calculation." "Between the two," she repeated. She looked at him steadily. "The application is in the common room. Sub-Commander Kell has the documentation ready. She paused. The form is blue. I've been told. Fill it out in the correct order, she said, with precision and without inflection, and something that was, under the precision, the specific quality of approval that didn't announce itself. All documentation attached. Yes, Commander. She stepped aside and led him through the entrance. The common room had people in it when he arrived. More than on the first day, nearly 30, he estimated, from multiple formations. He understood later that word traveled in the way it always did in a unit that had been together for years. The infrastructure assessment, and the voice council response making the rounds before the administrative notice had finished being read. He walked through the door and 30-odd heads turned. He was better at it now than he'd been on the first day. He held the silence for the moment it lasted, which was longer than the first time, the quality of it different. Not the impossible thing registered quiet of 3 days ago, but something more deliberate, more present. A room full of people looking at a fact they'd had time to consider and were now looking at directly. Then Arith Sova Kell stood up from the table in the far corner, where a blue form was waiting on the surface beside a neat stack of documentation. The room's attention followed her across the space to the door, and then back to him, and then did the thing attention sometimes does when it resolves, distributed itself, returned to its previous business, left the two of them to the particular quality of the space between them. She had the form. He had his documentation. His father had 31 years of opinions about what happened next. The blue form was the same weight as the violet one, roughly. Different paper stock. The Velhari used something between vellum and standard weight administrative paper for their formalized working relationship documents, which he would not have known was a distinction but could feel now that he had both kinds in his recent memory. The violet had been standard. The blue was heavier. It had more pages. He sat down across from her and looked at the documentation stack she'd assembled beside it. His certifications were there, in order. The network assessment figures, annotated in her handwriting in the margins. The voice council authorization, stamped, a different stamp than the violet one. He noted, the third seal orange of general administrative confirmation rather than the fourth seal violet of the Kel Sora Veth intake. The 6 connection assessment results, the coupling specification, the corrected load calculation. The J7 specification confirmation from the calibration run. The 2 additional connections that Vel Saren Kell had flagged on day 2 of the provisional, noted and cross-referenced. Everything in order. Everything attached. He looked at the stack and then at her. You've had this ready for a while, he said. The documentation has been assembled since the voice council inquiry was filed, she said. It made sense to have it in order, in the event the council approved. In the event, he said. The approval was not certain. But the documentation was assembled. She looked at him steadily. I read everything completely and in order, she said. In the conviction that the documentation knows what it says, she paused. That is not my line, but it applies. He thought about the expansion records run the previous night, the first night. The maintenance records for the protected site block, read before the evaluation began. The 4th connection flagged 2 days in, the load calculation corrected from data she'd had before he asked. You prepared for several possible outcomes, he said. I prepared for the most likely one, she said, based on the available evidence. He picked up the pen. In the correct order, he said. All documentation attached, she said. He sat across from her with the blue form between them and the documentation assembled in the correct sequence, and began to fill it out, and the common room moved around them with the ordinary quality of a space that had adjusted to a fact and moved on. The voice council confirmation arrived 6 days later. The working relationship was formalized across a 6-month initial period with a renewal provision. The 3rd District Network Assessment produced 3 additional protected site flags over the following 2 months, all resolved within their rated capacity margins. The Eastern Branch calculation proved accurate on every subsequent test. Arith Sovakel filed the renewal paperwork at the 4-month mark, which was 2 months before it was required. She cited ongoing infrastructure dependencies. Marcus noted when he signed it that the renewal form was also blue. She said she knew,